Welcome back to Turkish Spotlight Secrets. Before we settle into tonight's story, make sure you tap like, hit subscribe, and if you want to be part of our inner circle, click that join button. Your support keeps these conversations going and helps us bring you the moments everyone is quietly talking about. Now, let's get into it, because the internet has decided to hold its breath tonight for one name, Barış. He's a familiar presence on our screens, a figure who moves easily between camera lights and magazine covers. But the glow surrounding his work has always been intertwined with something more intimate, and tonight that private thread is what has everyone leaning closer. A single message has rippled across social media, screenshot and reshared so many times it feels like it's in the air itself. It didn't ignite chaos. It did something stranger, it softened the noise. It made people pause. Because embedded in that message was a fragment of the relationship that fans have watched with fascination, the bond between Barış and Elçin Sangu. Their names together have long been shorthand for chemistry, for that effortless energy that actors rarely sustain beyond the set. The public's imagination turned their glances and laughter into hopes. But the words that traveled tonight were quieter than the usual headlines. They were unadorned, careful, and disarmingly sincere. The post didn't come wrapped in blame or bravado. It read like someone choosing honesty over performance, and it suggested that their story, once overflowing with lightness, had been reshaped by time into something measured and restrained. The message, as fans pieced it together, offered a look not at a perfect romance preserved in amber, but at a partnership evolving under pressure. It acknowledged that what began full of spark and warmth had, little by little, become something that functioned more than it flourished. The phrase people kept repeating was simple, on paper. It became a shorthand for the feeling that the structure of their relationship remained, but the current that once animated it had thinned. Not a rupture. Not a scandal. A shift. What stunned everyone wasn't a revelation of betrayal or a theatrical goodbye. It was the calm. There was a steady, grounded acceptance in the tone, two people recognizing what had changed without turning the recognition into spectacle. The message seemed to suggest that respect endured, that care hadn't gone missing, but that the roles they once played for each other had transformed. The glimpses we had all held on to, the laughter between interviews, the compliments that felt real, the way their names moved as a pair, now sat beside a reality that asked for a different kind of courage. Fans who had followed every interview, every behind-the-scenes moment, began to fill comment sections with reflections rather than demands. They talked about how fame expands little problems into shadows that block the sun. They noted the way schedules swallow weekends, how expectations can become a second skin. Industry voices, usually quick to chase noise, suggested that this might be the moment when Barış steps a few paces back from the spotlight around his personal life. After a week of attention fixed on every syllable, a quieter approach almost felt inevitable. That quiet is what set this story apart from so many others. Neither Barış nor Elçin rushed to clarify or explain. There was no midnight statement, no multi-part interview, no pointed lyric buried in a soundtrack. The silence didn't feel evasive. It felt deliberate. And the internet, accustomed to building towers of speculation, instead built a garden of empathy. People chose to read between the lines with gentleness. Even voices from within the industry, those who normally feed the machine, leaned into respect. The conversation turned thoughtful. It admired the kind of grace that doesn't come with applause. One line from the circulating message clung to people like dew: sometimes life nudges you toward a turn you never saw on the map, and when you get there, you choose the road where you can finally breathe. It didn't sound like surrender. It didn't sound like anger. It sounded like recognition, of the way love can be true in one season and different in the next, of how staying past the point of tenderness can be a quieter kind of heartbreak. That sentence sparked a wave of personal confessions. Fans wrote about their own endings that weren't failures but transitions. They wrote about choosing peace over performance, honesty over habit. As the hours unfolded into days, the discussion shifted away from curiosity about what had happened and toward a broader understanding of what it means to love under scrutiny. Commentators pointed out how public personas, carefully sculpted by lighting and timing and the architecture of interviews, can conceal the delicate fibers of a relationship. Those fibers are sensitive to the smallest changes. They fray not with cruelty but with fatigue. The story that emerged wasn't a when, or a who, or a why in the tabloid sense. It was a how, a meditation on how even the most luminous pairings must navigate gravity. In the second wave of responses, people revisited the early days. They returned to those first interviews where quick glances told whole stories. They remembered the press junkets where compliments seemed to catch both of them by surprise, still fresh enough to blush. They recalled the red carpet moments, where the jokes and whispers between poses suggested a private joke no one else could hear. Back then, the language of their connection was easy to read. As time moved, that language shifted into something subtler. The partnership that remained looked sturdy from a distance, respectful, well-meaning, stable. But the emotional echo, the resonance that rings in the chest, seemed to have softened. The term on paper took on a life of its own. It became a metaphor people use to describe the shell of a relationship that still holds, even when the room inside has been rearranged. For many, this felt less like an accusation and more like a confession shared across the internet, an admission that the outward frame doesn't always match the inside. And while there were the inevitable voices looking for villains, they were outnumbered. The collective mood leaned toward gratitude, thank you for the moments, for the sparks, for the sense that magic could be real in front of a lens. Neither Barış nor Elçin broke the quiet to correct the public's reading. That absence of commentary did something unexpected, it drew a boundary that most chose to honor. It reminded everyone that the private core of a relationship doesn't owe anyone an explanation, even when the outer edges have always been public property. The unspoken agreement between audience and artist shifted, look if you must, but do not demand. What began to take shape was a narrative built on a different kind of bravery. Instead of amplifying tension for attention, they seemed to be choosing a softer exit from a chapter that had been written with care. Growth, rather than rupture. Recalibration, not collapse. A path that might lead them in separate directions, but not a path littered with broken glass. The admiration that followed was genuine. It is rare to see people famous for their chemistry show that affection can evolve without erasing what came before. By the time the third wave of commentary rolled in, the audience had found its footing. The focus drifted away from fretful guesses and landed on the truth so many had quietly lived. Sometimes love changes temperature. It cools from fever to a steady warmth, then to a memory that hums rather than sings. Fans filled timelines with their own stories, marriages that gently shifted into friendships, partnerships that chose dignity over denial. The message, repeated in different words and different languages, carried the same heartbeat: endings can be kind. In the end, what many took from the post associated with Barış was not that something precious had broken, but that something precious had been carefully set down. The bond between him and Elçin had not been torched for headlines or leveraged for sympathy. It was acknowledged, honored, and allowed to change. That choice, to keep the theatrics for the screen and let the truth stand unadorned, earned them a deeper kind of admiration. Fans realized that loving a public couple means accepting the parts of their story you'll never fully know. And while the two of them have offered no press releases to frame this moment, the story, in a way, feels complete. Not because every question has been answered, but because the questions have grown quieter. Acceptance has settled in. The lesson carried forward is simple enough to fit in a single breath: relationships can evolve without losing their worth. A photograph can be beautiful because of what it captures, even if the scene it depicts no longer exists. So we're left with this, a chapter that doesn't end with slamming doors, but with a careful closing and a hand resting on the wood for a second longer, as if to say thank you. Maybe Barış will let the lights dim around his private life for a while. Maybe Elçin will do the same. Maybe they won't. It hardly matters as much as the clear boundary they've drawn. The performance is for work, the tender math of love remains theirs. If you followed them from the earliest days, you probably feel both the ache and the ease. You remember the first spark and recognize the grace of letting go. That doesn't diminish the joy of what once was, it protects it. The applause we hear now isn't for a new role or a premiere. It's for restraint. For clarity. For choosing the kind of ending that leaves no one bruised. Tell us what you think. How did this moment land with you? Do you see the same quiet courage in the way Barış and Elçin have moved through it? Drop your thoughts below. And before you go, like, subscribe, and hit join to support Turkish Spotlight Secrets. We'll be back soon with more stories from the stars you can't stop rooting for, and the private truths that make them human.